Hi, thank you for talking with us today.
Oh, my pleasure.
Could you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure, I'm Jamie Trost. I'm one of two captains for Pride of Baltimore II. We rotate in command of the vessel, which of course is historically evocative of the privateers that sailed out of Fells Point during the War of 1812.
Okay. Now, we are on the Pride of Baltimore II. Could you tell us a little bit about the Pride of Baltimore II?
Well, again, Pride of Baltimore II is not an exact replica of any one privateer from the War of 1812, but she's historically evocative of the whole class. She represents a lot of the features, both in the hull and the rig, a very dramatic sail plan, armaments in order to hunt down British vessels as prizes, and really evokes that history of the Fells Point privateers.
Okay. So, what is the history of this particular boat? Why a replica?
Pride of Baltimore II was built following the loss of the Pride of Baltimore, which was a sailing vessel that was built in the 1970s by the city of Baltimore in order to further the waterfront renaissance that was going on under Mayor Schaefer. The city had played host to an Operation Sail event in conjunction with the U.S. Navy and several large European square riggers in 1976. Construction was going on at that stage of Pride of Baltimore in order to bring people down to the harbor, and the inspiration of having all these ships from all around the world in the inner harbor of Baltimore led the city managers and the mayor to decide to voyage Pride of Baltimore, and she did that successfully into the Caribbean, to the West Coast, and finally to Europe. And it was on her return from Europe in 1986 that she was lost. But that whole time she carried the message of Baltimore as a place not only in history but in the modern era of maritime activity and a place to come see and visit to enrich yourself.
And the Pride II is taking on that tradition?
And Pride II was built in a direct response to the citizens of Baltimore wanting to replace Pride of Baltimore after she was lost at sea in 1986.
And do you go all around the world with this?
This ship's actually been much further than her predecessor. The vessel's been to Europe 5 times, actually sailed to Asia about 14 years ago on a voyage to help engender some relationships between the Maryland Port Administration and some ports in China and Japan and in Korea as well.
What we filmed today was a program you guys have. Could you talk a little bit about it?
The program's called Pride on the Chesapeake, and it's an underway educational adventure. This is the first time in the 25-year history of Pride of Baltimore II that we've ever had an underway experiential education program. We've done some education at the dock. We've done some education through information sent back from the ship underway as she voyages to far off ports, but we've never had a program before that actually took students away from the dock out sailing and taught them not only about setting sails and steering the ship, but the actual activities that were going on during the War of 1812. And this program goes even further and explores some of the sentiments of different citizens leading up to the war, which of course was the most closely contested vote for going to war in the history of the United States Congress.
A couple of previous episodes we've had of this, we've talked about the War of 1812 and how it's kind of, I don't want to say forgotten, but it's not talked about that often. So it's amazing that you're actually talking about it.
It's a confusing conflict for a lot of people, and right behind us, of course, we have the U.S. Naval Academy, and they teach the War of 1812 as a conflict between the Americans and the British that was won by the Canadians and lost by the Indians. Which in some ways is true, and depending on your point of view, the war was either a success or a failure, and in every theater that changes. But Maryland played a very central part in the War of 1812, especially in the later stages. In the early stages, the privateers out of Fells Point were storming off to sea and having a lot of success against the British and claiming their merchant ships as prizes. Later on in the war, the British mounted an invasion in 1814 where they come all the way up to Washington, D.C. They burn the Capitol after defeating American forces at St. Leonard's Creek and then Bladensburg. They eventually want to come do the same thing in Baltimore in September, but the citizens of Baltimore are not going to have the same attitude that they did in D.C. They've dug in. They dug in at Hempstead Hill. They assisted the military forces at Fort McHenry, and it was really the citizens taking up arms to defend their own city that saved Baltimore from the same fate as D.C. And of course, this type of vessel and the success that it represented was exactly what the British wanted to come into Fells Point and to burn down the shipyards for.
So it was really boats like this that were the thorn in Britain's side. during that war.
I've heard it said, and I don't know if it's an exact quote, but the sentiment of the British was that they wanted to come to Baltimore, and especially to Fells Point, to clear out that nest of pirates, because they saw the privateers as such a thorn in their side.
I know you said this is your first year, but how long has it been going on this year?
This is the fourth week of programming for this year. So we've done now about 20 schools have come out sailing with us, usually 2.5 hours, so we swap at the midday point. And there's as many as 30 students in each class.
Wow. Out of the classes you've taught, have you seen that, is the War of 1812 and privateers and our role in it something that the kids know, or is it something that they're actually being enlightened of through this class?
There are pieces that they know. Of course, well, the first question we ask them is, what do you know about the War of 1812? And they typically say that it started in 1812. So that's a good point to start from. They're aware of the Star Spangled Banner being written, which of course was written when Francis Scott Key saw the flag still over Fort McHenry. But the rest of the relationship that their own state has to the war is a little bit hazy in their minds, and the correlation between privateer and navy and pirate is very, very mysterious territory for them. So we're helping to educate them on those different concepts.
Could you actually talk about that? Privateers and pirates. We were at the Privateer Festival, and when you walk around, you see people dressed in, and there were a few people dressed in period clothing, but the rest are dressed as pirates. Johnny Depp type pirates. What is the difference?
No, the difference is a pretty simple difference, is that privateering was a regulated industry that was licensed by a government, and not exclusively the U.S. government. From about 1240 onward, maritime nations of the world were issuing some sort of license to people in order to take their own private vessels, which is where the privateer comes from, out to sea to either gain profit or to recoup losses. In the early days, it started out that if the Spanish had taken a ship from you, then you could get a license to go back and take an equal amount of value from the Spanish, for instance, if you were an English privateer. That expanded a little bit further. The French were doing it as well. And eventually the concept became the license was a letter of marque, or a letter of marque and reprisal. And these documents allowed you to go out and only claim vessels with which your country was hostile with. So that had to happen during the time of war, and it had to only be the vessels that were designated as being from the enemy. In France, they were called letters of letter de course. So the idea of a corsair and a privateer are pretty much the same thing.
So privateers were pretty important to at least America during the War of 1812.
Yes, they were an extremely necessary force multiplier. At the time the War of 1812 broke out, the American Navy had a total of 16 ships in it. Only 7 or so of those were really full-size naval warships that would even rate on the number of guns that they had. And the British had somewhere in the neighborhood of 600 ships, including multiple hundreds of ships of the line. So not very good odds for a game of dodgeball that's going to be played with iron balls shot at the speed of sound or better. So by having privateers, the American government was acknowledging that the supply chain that England is going to have to use in order to get its forces in Canada and any vessels along the east coast of America continually fed and watered and kept in stores could be very easily cut if the merchant vessels that were assisting in this were taken by American privateers.
The ship is basically a living history. It's as you said, it's a conglomerate of the style of that. Do you find that having a relic like this helps preserve history in a way that just textbooks don't?
Oh, absolutely, because you could write all day long about what a privateer looked like or what the experience of sailing a privateer was, and in fact Captain Miles and I have tried in blogs and different logs and articles to describe that experience, but to actually have people out on board and to have them put their hands on the lines, to see the sails set. We may be using slightly different materials. We have some synthetics in the sail and the cordage that we use. We have some wire in the rig. The hull has some reinforcing in places that would have been not historic then, but that's all for longevity. The fact of the matter is that everything that an 1812 privateer would have been familiar with can be seen on board this vessel. And if you brought some of those guys back from Thomas Boyle's Comet or Chaucer herself, Joshua Barney's Rossi crew would come on board and could make sense of what we're doing today.
I get that the engines are not only for safety reasons, but in some cases convenience. But has this been taken out and run like a privateer vessel of that time, where it was just sailed and...
We make a point of sailing as much as we possibly can. I mean, the engines are used as a tool of last resort, and the fact of the matter is a privateer in 1812 didn't have a schedule to keep. So if we could happily meander along at 2 or 3 knots until a better breeze came in and show up 3 days late to a festival, then that would be fine. But that's frowned upon in the modern era. So we've got to eventually throw in the towel and say we've got to get from this point to that point because we have commitments to make an appearance or run some sails or whatever. But we've done passages where we've sailed essentially off the dock in one port and sailed up to make a grandstand in the entrance of another port without ever motoring.
Oh, wow.
And that's always our goal if we can do it.
Obviously, this is a sail. Well, it's a sailing ship, and there are sail boats and whatnot. But it seems like this is quite a bit different than our modern sailboats. Do you feel like? Obviously, you must know more about what it was like back then, but how big of a change was it when you came to this as opposed to going to a sailboat?
It was interesting. Well, so I grew up sailing on the Great Lakes, which is a place that the War of 1812 had a lot of impact on, and sailing on modern vessels like you see around Annapolis Harbor and Baltimore Harbor. And then I started into traditional sailing with a relatively simple traditional vessel, much less complicated than Pride of Baltimore II. And we actually pull our crew from people who've already done a season of sailing on one vessel that's maybe a little bit easier than this ship, so they already know the basics and we can ramp that up. The wind's the same, the physics are the same, the number of steps involved in each evolution of altering sail or setting sail are a lot more complicated, but it just gets to be second nature after you've done it enough times. I mean, there's only so many ways that you can attempt it. A lot of it is very well documented, and the stuff that isn't, then we've experimented with enough times to know that we have a procedure for how to deal with it.
Was this an effective way of getting around? Say, in the past, I get, we have engines now that make things a lot easier, but was this a really effective way?
I would say for 1812?
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Probably the most effective way, because the thing that it's hard to imagine just seeing the ship in a modern context what the whole rest of the Chesapeake Bay looked like at the time. I mean, the predecessors to the privateers were being used in the Chesapeake Bay, which is a relatively protected water. They had very sharp built, very sleek hulls for windless days like today to make the most efficiency of sailing around. And then they put on clouds and clouds and piles of canvas to make them go when the wind wasn't blowing. And your other alternative, while it might have been slow-going sailing, was that there weren't a lot of roads, so you might be hacking your way through a forest or wilderness. If there were roads, they were probably dirt, and if it rained for any period of time, like it does a lot in the spring here, then no wagon would have a chance of making it through. And even still, we have about 97 tons worth of cargo space on board Pride of Baltimore II. We were telling the students earlier today, how much do you think a donkey might be able to carry? And they figured a pretty generous estimate of about a quarter ton per donkey. That's a pretty heavy load for one donkey, but that would mean they'd need about 400 donkeys to move the same volume as the ship does, and that's a lot of work.
It is a lot of work. You could almost say that this was the backbone of our expansion, at least through the coast, of being able to move goods from the north to the south and the south to the north.
Oh, I think all over the country, yeah, especially north to south along the East Coast, it played a great role. Of course, without ships, we would have never ended up coming to the New World in the first place. And then furthermore, we're making our 13th voyage into the Great Lakes this year with Pride of Baltimore II.
Oh, wow.
And that was a tremendous area of seaborne or lakeborne shipping by sail, because you could get as far away from the ocean into the heart of a country as is really possible by water, by shipping things to Duluth, Minnesota, and then collecting things as well. So it's all about what the area needs and what it has. If they're taking manufactured goods that have come into a port, for, let's say Buffalo on the Great Lakes, and taking them up to Duluth, Minnesota, then exchanging them for the iron ore they're taking out of the mountains there, that's pretty effective trade. The same thing if you're taking, in the days of 1812, tobacco from the south and exchanging it for lumber from Connecticut. The idea of putting it on board a ship would mean that it would get there in much faster time than you could ever hope for if it were going by wagon train or carriage or stage, whatever they had to drag things along.
So this is a history that people really just shouldn't ignore or forget, because it really built us.
It is. It's where we came from. I mean, this is especially in the eastern part of the country, we owe most of our industry, most of our foundation to seaborne travel.
What's on the horizon for the Pride of Baltimore II?
Well, earlier this week, 2 days ago, in fact, she celebrated her 25th launching anniversary, so her 25th birthday. That's a quarter century. The ship is built so strong that it's very easy to imagine, with the kind of care that we've given her, she could last a full century and possibly more if we keep after her. So the horizon's a little bit limitless at the moment. It's what we feel is the best use of the vessel in representing the state of Maryland, representing the city of Baltimore, representing the maritime tradition of the whole Chesapeake Bay. And the mission of the ship is to carry that out there for the people of Maryland, to carry the name of Baltimore, to sell the attractions of Baltimore, to make people proud. I mean, the reason for the name of the ship is in fact people should be proud of Baltimore and the maritime achievements that it's accomplished.
The Pride of Baltimore has taken part at the Fells Point Privateer Festival, and that's actually where we met you. What do you think of the Fells Point Privateer Festival?
I think it's a great way to bring people down to Fells Point and to show them that Fells Point's real existence is based on a maritime culture. I mean, it's very easy to forget that when you're walking around these days, because everything's it looks like a quaint touristy area with water attached to it, but the whole bedrock of Fells Point is based on maritime commerce. And in fact, the streets everyone calls cobblestones literally are ballast stone streets. The bricks that they're made of are not cobbled together. They're laid in a specific pattern because they're exact squares, and they came out of the hulls of ships. So when you're stepping down Thames Street or up the lower part of Broadway in Fells Point, you're literally walking all over the world, because we have no idea where those stones may have come from. And that's one of the reasons they've lasted so long, is that they're very deep and they're rooted. Just that. So that's how deep the maritime culture goes in Fells Point. Is it's not just superficial. Those stones are what made that neighborhood of Baltimore what it is. And I think that with the resurgence of pirate culture after the Disney movie series and Johnny Depp's portrayal of the crazy Captain Jack Sparrow, a lot of people, kids and more like adults, have fun with the pirate theme. But the recent trend of Privateer Day has been to involve more of the serious historical aspects. If you saw this year on Broadway Pier, the Maryland Historical Society was there with a booth talking about what the actual facts of the War of 1812 were. Of course, we're there sailing and then open to the public and then sailing again. And then Fort McHenry had their reenactors down there as well to show the more military side that eventually enlisted a lot of citizen support. So I think that the focus of it, as much fun as it should be, as much fun as it possibly could be for everyone, but the focus of it to remain grounded in the idea that the actual facts of the matter is that the citizens of Baltimore, who were law-abiding people, who probably weren't drinking rum from 6 in the morning until 2 the next morning, we're going to see as volunteers to help their country with a very dynamic design that evolved naturally in the Chesapeake Bay. The Baltimore Clipper, as a moniker for this type of Chesapeake Bay sleek built design, is a tremendous coup for Baltimore that was only possible because of the daring actions of the Baltimore privateers, because this design was used all throughout the Chesapeake Bay. And prior to the War of 1812, people mostly saw it when they were coming into the mouth of the bay in the form of the Virginia pilot schooners going out to meet the seagoing ships with the pilot who had the knowledge to bring them in. And so everyone knew them as Virginia pilot schooners. Well, if there hadn't been a War of 1812, they would still know this sleek Chesapeake Bay design only as a Virginia pilot schooner. So Baltimore's success with the privateers claimed our stake over all of the Chesapeake Bay design that preceded it by using it in a more effective and world-ranging way than it had ever been done before.
Which is why it's now the Pride of Baltimore.
The Pride of Baltimore, yeah, and is a Baltimore Clipper, not a Chesapeake Bay Clipper.
Excellent. You were talking about maintenance and how this could last almost a century at least. What sort of ongoing preservation do you have to do to this boat to keep it in its
All of it.
All of it.
The vessel obviously is made of wood, so the coatings of the wood need to be maintained, and any small amount of deterioration needs to be attacked because we've got to replace a piece of wood. Or anywhere there's rot, it needs to be addressed and dealt with immediately. Maybe that's a small engraving piece that replaces old wood. Maybe it's a full replacement of a plank. That's very rare because we take the steps to be preventative about that. We have to keep paint on her. We have to keep varnished surfaces up. We've got to maintain the bottom of the ship from any potential worm damage by keeping coats of paint on that ship. So we haul the vessel every year. And that's just in terms of that would have to happen no matter what we were doing with the ship. Because we choose to voyage her relatively ambitiously offshore and up the coast and occasionally going overseas, that care has to be upped even more, because if you look around, the ship is made of millions of pieces of wood, and even though they're all very solidly put together, they're always working against each other and moving small little bits. So in between each of the seams, there's caulking material that's put in, cotton and then hemp, which is called oakum in this application, and then sealed up with either a boiled pitch that then cools and hardens in the seam but stays flexible, or a compound that's smeared in on the side planking where it wouldn't be practical to pour it. And we haven't even gotten to the fact that she has rigging and sails, and so every stitch of the sails needs to be gone over at the end of every season. We take all the sails down, we take all the spars down, and we do a very thorough inspection through the fall and the winter of every moving piece on the ship, and all the lines eventually will need to be replaced on some kind of cycle. Things that are higher wear obviously get replaced more frequently. So it's just a tremendous effort to keep up with all of the different pieces of it, and then add in the fact that we do have engines, we have a generator, we have electrical equipment that runs on board the ship, navigation equipment, and all that has to be serviced on a regular basis too.
And it's interesting you were talking about the pitch and the oakum. I've heard that before, that's what they actually did on the ships in the past. So a lot of the same practices that kept the ships back then working fine are the same ones you're using now?
There's some things that we do that the technology just hasn't improved on. If you're going to build a vessel in the way that Pride of Baltimore II is, where we have a framework and then some people call them ribs, they're actually called frames. They're all attached to a keel and they're all made up of varying different pieces. There's an outer planking put on top of that, and then there's an inner planking for stiffness that's called the sealing planking. And each plank has a small gap. You can't completely seal them, and so they have a triangular or beveled edge, and to fill that void you need a material that's going to be able to be made hard through manipulation and tools. So we twist or pleat the oakum or the cotton first and then the oakum and hammer it in with a wooden mallet that's reinforced with some steel, but it still has a little bit of flexibility for all that giving. And unless you're going to change the entire way you build the ship out of wood or change to a different material, there's no better way that's been invented to do that.
So oddly enough, there's almost like layer upon layer upon layer of preservation. Not only is this a living historical ship, but then you have to keep a maintenance up to preserve it. But the maintenance that you're doing is preserving a history of maintenance that was already done.
Yeah, I think you find that in a lot of things. If you're going to do things a traditional way, you have to learn all the skills to continue to do them in a traditional way. This is in the same way that you made the comparison to the modern yachts. If you came on board Pride of Baltimore II with the expectation of sailing her like she was a J-22 or a J-70 is the new vessel that I saw out there today, you would have a very difficult time with the reality that that those things wouldn't work.
Well, thank you very much for talking with us.
Absolutely, my pleasure.
And I hope to see you around.
Yeah, well, you certainly will if you hang out in Fells Point.